Welcome to the Cinematic Flashback Podcast. Get ready to hop into the Wayback Machine as we journey through the wild, bold, and unforgettable films of the 1970s. Each episode, we'll break down a classic or not-so-classic movie with a fun, fresh approach. We'll explore the who's who of each film, dive into the premise and the plot, see how it performed then and now, and wrap it up with, did it groove through decades or lose its feet? I am your host, Chuck Bryan, and with me today is Matt Sargent. Matt, thank you so much for being here. Do you still pick your feet in Poughkeepsie?
A classic line from a classic movie, for sure. I am happy to join you on this journey, and I thought this would be a great exercise to get together with you, and we can talk about some movies that were 70s were when I was 10 in 1971. So from 10 to 19.
Wow.
I graduated from high school in 1980. The 70s are my years for a lot of impressionable movies, and I saw quite a bit when I was young. I'm excited about this whole journey.
In 79, I think I was going into 6th grade. For me, a lot of the movies of the 70s have always been the big tentpole movies. Star Wars, Star Trek, Godfather, Jaws. I'm really looking forward to finding films that I'm not as familiar with, but everyone says you should see. Matt, what are we watching tonight?
We are going to be talking about The French Connection.
All right, Popeye's here. Get your hands on your heads. Get off the bar and get on the wall. What's my name?
Popeye Doyle. If he doesn't like you, he'll take you apart. And it's all perfectly legal, because Doyle fights dirty
You want to take a ride there, fat man?
and plays rough.
Anybody want a milkshake?
Doyle is bad news, but he's a good cop.
We're going now. Bye.
Came out in 1971. It is a crime thriller that was really unlike anything that had come before. It was a very early film by William Friedkin, and it's based on a true story. The stars are actors that went on to have amazing careers. Roy Scheider, and playing Popeye Doyle was Gene Hackman. This was not his first film, as I understand, but it was a seminal film for him, as I think many people recognize.
So my introduction to both of those actors, Roy Scheider was obviously Jaws 2, because I was way too young to see Jaws when it came out. And for Gene Hackman, he was Lex Luthor in Superman the movie. So imagine my surprise watching this film and trying to put Gene Hackman's Lex Luthor into Jimmy Popeye Doyle.
Yeah, so that's funny, our different perspectives on time. Roy Scheider was definitely the first I had interaction with him was Jaws, the actual original Jaws, which I actually saw in a movie theater.
Wow.
Yeah, it was amazing. And Gene Hackman, I have a hard time remembering. I've seen so many movies with him in them, and they were at various different times. And I don't think they were any kind of chronological order. Like I may have seen him in a movie from later before I actually really sat down and watched The French Connection. I also think I remember my parents not allowing me to go with the family to go see it.
Oh, really? Why's that?
It was rated R, so it was too violent.
Appropriate.
Yeah, they took me to see Chinatown.
Oh, wow.
Which, yeah, if you've ever seen Chinatown, there's a lot of violence.
You're not going to say French Connection, but Chinatown.
But let's get back to The French Connection.
I wanted to set some context for the movie, because context is king. It's really hard to remember what the world was like. You might not have even been there when this film came out. I looked up some trivia. Did you know that the first Starbucks opened at Pike Place Market in Seattle, Washington in 1971?
That's amazing. I thought it was much younger than that.
I don't know what their cup of coffee cost at the time. We're both application developers. We work for a consulting company, and we live and die by email today. Ray Tomlinson invented internet-based email.
That's pretty funny.
And what do you think the number one show would have been on TV at the time?
If I was to think back, it was All in the Family, but that makes a lot of sense. It was a very popular show. I remember it. So it was definitely appointment style TV. But we did watch All in the Family, and I watched All in the Family in reruns for a long time.
My wife and I, we grew up in a house where our parents both watched it. And to this day, we can sing the entire opening song. Those were the days. Also, in that top 10 show was a police program called Adam 12. It's still on MeTV quite a bit. Something I wanted to come back to as we get into the French Connection is how the sanitized version of television police shows, how they differ from what movie audiences were going to see with the French Connection.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think it's good for our listeners to try to put themselves back in time a little bit and try to understand what was life like when this movie hit the scene. Life was portrayed on the screen as bewitched and Mayberry RFD, but it wasn't realistic. This isn't what really happened with police work.
All pretty much a picturesque, sanitized view that didn't match with reality. But
Sure.
At the time, it was entertainment, and that's what people were looking for.
Sure, I remember my mom was a big fan of a show called Dragnet, which was a little more gritty, but it was definitely sanitized. So the idea that you went into the movie theater and saw this movie, which when we look at it now, yeah, that's probably pretty realistic or nearly realistic from what our experience is now. But back then, it was shocking.
Oh, yeah.
I think people were really shocked. And there was a lot of controversy over it as well. They thought it was a terrible thing. There are other people saying it's a cinematic masterpiece, that it was the first of a new genre of filmmaking and films that would change things. And I think the latter proved to be true. It was a turning point for how police were depicted, how movies were made, how soundtracks interacted with the movies. Before, we had wonderful soundtracks, and it was a significant part of the movie, but it wasn't intended to emote a sense of foreboding or stress on the audience, where I think with the French Connection, it absolutely is.
One of the things that really attracted me about movies of the 70s is that there was a much different experience going to the movies. Today, you sit through multiple advertisements while you're waiting for the previews to begin. They call it a pregame show. And it used to be you would go and sit down, and probably by the 80s, they may have started playing a trivia slide. But for the most part, it was silent. The lights went down, the curtains came up. It was just a completely different experience.
Well, I have a funny story about that. I'm old enough to remember when you would go to a movie and the preview for a PG-rated movie was absolutely R-rated. So nowadays, previews are all like PG or G, or the same as the movie you're going to see. You had maybe 2 or 3 previews, leaders, or what do they call them? Trailers. Sorry, not leaders. Trailers for upcoming movies. But that was basically it. Nowadays, there's at least 40 minutes of them.
It's a good 30 to 40 minutes. Now, one of the things, of course, I do is I like being able to pick my chair, and then I know I can come about 30 minutes after the advertised time and just slide in.
Well, we live really close to the movie theater. Literally, I can look and say, oh, the movie started 20 minutes ago. So no problem. Buy a ticket. We can still see.
Definitely a different time.
Yeah.
We already talked about Gene Hackman and Roy Scheider.
Both detectives.
Roy Scheider actually was convinced that he had lost this part because he stormed out of the audition, but that was the reason why he was cast.
That's perfect. That's so funny because that makes a lot of sense.
Fernando Rey played Lane Charnier. Tony LoBianco played Sal Boca. Bill Hickman played the federal agent. And the other movie that he was in that I knew of was Bullet from 1968. And then playing the villainous Monsieur Pierre was Marcel Bozzuffi. William Friedkin was the director, and the other movie that I knew him from was from The Exorcist. The screenwriter was Ernest Tiedemann. The composer was Don Ellis. Owen Rosamond was a cinematographer, and Barry Malkin was the editor. This film was nominated for multiple awards, and it won the Academy for both Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, and Best Adapted Screenplay.
One of the things you'll remark when you watch the movie is it really starts out quite slow.
Yeah.
Very normal. You're basically in some French city. I think you later find out it's Marseille or something. I think it's Marseille. And you you start to see a policeman doing some police work and following someone, and that progresses and you meet some of the main characters. So you see this Alain Charnier. I wouldn't call him a heavy because he's very suave, but you find out that he came out of the poor, what do you call it? The loading docks. You see a scene where his girlfriend is obviously buying him clothes and he thanks her for buying more clothes and making him look sophisticated, not like right off the docks, I think is what he says. And that's important because you realize this guy he looks a dandy, but he definitely is not a dandy. And then you also meet his sort of sidekick heavy, maybe you'd call him the muscle, and the interaction with the French detective, which ends, badly for the French detective. And of course, it's classic French movie making because a baguette makes an appearance.
The heavy, his name was Rousseau.
Right.
Within
Rousseau.
minutes of the movie, right, he's already killing this detective.
Yeah, he kills somebody with basically no hesitation at all. And then Elaine and him later talk about it, and to some extent, they're like, it had to be done. It had to be done. He was getting too close. And what you find is that these are the guys that have some drugs that they want to be able to get into the United States to be able to distribute.
And this whole plot, by the way, a lot of this plot is what you pick up as you go on. At the very beginning of the film, something is happening. They're bringing in this actor, Henri Devereaux. You start to get the feeling that he's going to be the distraction for bringing whatever the drugs are into the United States.
Yeah, at this point in the movie, you're not really sure what they're going to use this actor for, but it's funny. They show this actor and they show that he's agreed to work with them, although the muscle guy really doesn't like it. But and one of the things that you see is they're cruising around France in a giant American-made car.
It's this brown car.
It's out of place.
Yes.
So it immediately draws your eye. If you follow the car, you follow the drugs.
And then the titles tell us we're in Brooklyn. There's parts of New York when it's under the neon lights. It looks so romantic. But if it's not at night and it's not lit and you're seeing it for what it is, it's a dump. It's so dirty. Even the grain of the film just brings that out and draws so much attention to New York.
I have to tell you that a lot of New York was very rough and very bad. My parents wouldn't even take us up there. My wife's dad grew up in Jackson Heights, and very similar to the neighborhoods that are depicted in this movie, but on the other side of the city, but unkempt and dirty. And you had the unions doing the trash, and they may or may not have picked it up, and broken down buildings that clearly real estate wasn't where it is nowadays, where an empty lot with a semi broken down building just exists. That in New York now. It's pretty gross. There's some pretty nasty, interesting places. And I think the filmmaker did a good job of trying to capture that and show it. And we get there. We're in Brooklyn and we're meeting the protagonists, essentially. Besides the bad guys, we're meeting offensively the good guys.
In this case, the good guys, and I'm going to put this in air quotes because I don't think the main character is necessarily a good guy.
So I'll argue that with you, but go ahead.
He's the character that we're with. So outside of this bar, you see a Santa Claus, who is Jimmy Popeye Doyle. Selling hot dogs is Buddy Rousseau.
So the guy Popeye dressed up as Santa Claus, is real close to where this bar is, and he can see into the bar. And Roy Scheider's character is out serving he's actually selling a hot dog to some guy. And as soon as Popeye Doyle character sees this guy that they're trying to get, and he rings the bell, and immediately they both start to go in, and the Roy Scheider character goes right into the bar, takes off his apron, and basically tries to get this guy. Unfortunately, they're in a crowded bar, and the guy makes it out, and there's a foot race. But before the foot race starts, he pulls a knife, and he cuts the Roy Scheider character on the arm.
Sticks him with a shiv.
I think part of this whole at the end of this, they're very excited, they're very angry, because he got knifed. And they know the guy knows them. That's the other thing. He knows them. It's clear during this interrogation that he has had run-ins possibly with them before. And then the classic during this interrogation, it's pretty rough. They catch him and then they drag him to an empty lot, and they are holding him up against the wall and really roughing him up or trying to get this information out of him. And that's when we have this classic interaction between the Roy Scheider character asking normal questions and Popeye Doyle asking these crazy questions about picking your feet in Poughkeepsie which is just meant to throw people off. And it's a little bit weird because you're like, what is he doing? And us as watching the scenes, we're not the person being roughed up. We didn't just have a foot race. It would be very disconcerting to have this guy asking you about going to Poughkeepsie, and maybe you had been there, and
maybe you had been there,
and maybe something bad happened when you were there. You immediately start to think about all the bad things. And then this other person asks you your question, and you're like, well, nothing happened there. I know what's happening here.
I can answer that question.
And they almost get the information they seek, which is nobody has any drugs.
But it is starting to establish this fact that the stuff that people are holding is really very small potatoes, if you will.
Right. And that's been going on for some time.
So one of the things that this scene establishes is not only does it establish the way in which William Friedkin is going to film this movie, it is very much, it has that handheld, almost documentary style. There's a lot of long takes, and then they bring it in close, and it has that feel throughout the entire movie. It gives the film verisimilitude.
The visual style is one of the most distinguishing features. Friedkin used a handheld camera to create a raw, almost documentary-like feel that really immersed the audiences in the underbelly of 1970s New York. That's absolutely what you get from that. And then it's shot, as we were talking about before, in location in the city's some rough areas, right? That's where they shot it. It's contrasted sort of the polished crime thrillers of previous decades, where they're fancy hotels and everything like that. And clearly we know from looking back, because we have the leisure of looking back from this time, that it impacted tons of different movies to get the same sort of documentary style kind of authenticity.
I think of, like, right off the bat, I think of Taxi Driver. It's another New York film. It's very gritty.
Serpico, and not so much like the gritty parts, but Dirty Harry had it came out in the same year. But it certainly had that same kind of hard-boiled, rougher side of Police.
It's the West Coast version.
They pack it up. They're and Popeye Doyle getting ready to leave, and he's at the door. He's about to go out the door, and he stops. And he's waiting for his partner to come out. His partners are going to go home, so I'm going home. So I'll buy you a drink. Yeah, no, I'm going to bed. I'm tired. They go to a bar. That's where the payoff starts, because you see the characters that make up the people that are trying to do the drug deal.
We're introduced to one of the best songs I've heard this month. Popeye goes into this bar. He is always looking. He's always on duty. He's never really at rest.
Right. He's not just having a drink.
No. In fact, he notices two known junk connections at a table. And there's this one stranger that he doesn't know who's throwing a lot of cash around. And this turns out to be Sal Boca and his wife. And they are the ones who are working with Elaine to get the drugs, so that they try and get the drugs to be able to distribute it.
They're the middlemen in the deal, essentially. They're the people in New York that are going to hook up Elaine and his supply with the underworld distributors. They're the people in New York that are going to hook up Elaine and his supply with the underworld distributors. And they are new at this.
Very new.
This is their big break.
Sal Boca, to his credit, he did rob Tiffany's in broad daylight. I thought maybe he was connected or something. But we get into the first of several sequences where Popeye and Russo are tailing the suspects.
They don't even know who he is. They follow him and ultimately follow him back to their sandwich shop.
Right.
Which is hilarious, because she goes in with a giant hairdo with the thing over the top. And the next time you see her, she's holding it in her hand, and she's a dark-haired American woman, lovely, really, as is, but without the big hair. It's so funny. And there's a similar thing I want to point out with that, is that they switched their cars about as much as they're switching her hair. So it was one of those funny kind of coincidences of, like, they're switching to a different car, and then now she doesn't have her hair anymore. So they clearly are trying to throw anybody off, but they're terrible at it.
Oh, yeah. They're 100% trying to cover their tracks, because they know that they're starting on the beginning of the story of making this drug deal. So during this time, they also learn of one other character, Joel Weinstock. Now, Joel is the lawyer / money guy who is going to finance Sal to be able to get the drugs. And once they find out Once they make the connection with Sal, Jimmy goes to the captain and they get the court order so that they can wiretap the phones and they can start listening to them on their wiretaps. And that's where we're introduced to the two federal agents, Muldrick and Klein. Muldrick, there's some beef between him and Popeye due to a earlier case that they had where another cop had gotten killed. Muldrick keeps digging on Popeye about getting this other person killed. On Stakeout, they're listening in on Sal's phone conversations with the wiretap when suddenly there's a French accent on the end of one of the phones. Elaine is asking Boca to meet him at the hotel. They're all tailing Boca.
The way they filmed it clearly had a strong influence from real police because they showed how the real police work and how they hand off, and they have a phone and they have a radio phone. They're talking to him like, okay, yeah, he just went by. Okay, I'm on him. We had to turn it off. They saw us or they made us. So there was a lot of that very realistic following and how incredibly important they were because they were trying to find out where things were and what was going on. And it's literally the only tool they had. Clearly, this is not the age of cell phones and that sort of thing where everybody does everything by sending a message. They had to go to where they were going to go. And so tailing was the way you figured out what crime they were going to do and how they're going to do it.
And consequently, there's a lot of times when there's little to no conversation or dialogue.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Whatsoever.
It's one of the things that's marked in this movie to me is how little conversation, how little dialogue there is. And there's whole minutes that go by where they're just doing these tailings and trying to figure stuff out. And as a person watching the movie, you're not given a lot of exposition to figure out what's happening. It's really on you to figure out, why are they following? Oh, okay, this is why they're following them. You're really in the dark for a good part of it, in my opinion.
There are two scenes in this film that I think are just masterful. Sal Boca looking at getting a profit of $32 million once it comes off the street. However, Weinstock is a little bit nervous. He wants to wait till the end of the week to make this deal. So they're going to go meet in Washington, D.C. because of all the heat that's on it. Lane comes out of his hotel. The two federal agents never see Frog One leave the hotel. This is where Popeye is coming up.
And also Popeye trying to get to the phone to call the federal agents. Yes. Because at one point he gets into a phone box to tell them, I'm trailing him. And they're like, no, he's still in the hotel.
No, he's right here on the platform. And you've seen this done so many times since then where one person gets on the train, the other person steps off of it. And then he goes back on right as the other person. And they're trying to time the doors closing.
Yeah, I think it was so funny because that scene progresses from pretending to be totally innocuous. Like he jumps off the train to throw some trash away.
Yes.
And then Popeye has to jump off the train. And then it starts to get obvious that this is not innocuous. He is definitely following me.
Unfortunately for Popeye, he loses it. He loses this round. And Elaine is on the train and is pulling away. And as Elaine goes by Popeye, he just waves at him.
Yeah,
just his fingers are moving like he's saying bye-bye. So off he goes. That was one of my favorite scenes.
The funny thing is there's a juxtaposition between Elaine's suave and debonair, very put together, his trimmed beard. He's very neat. And the last thing he does is he sticks his umbrella through and opens the door and gets out. And then Popeye's, it was very well done. But anyway, I do want to talk. You said before, you're like, Popeye's like a bad guy to some extent. I'll argue that a little bit. He's a driven guy.
Yeah. What I was meaning more by that is he's much more of an anti-hero.
Yeah, he's for sure to some extent, he's an anti-hero. He's clearly a guy who's probably had, if he was ever married, it ended in disaster, right? Because he is a one-trick pony, one-track mind. He is nothing but working. And that's what drives him. And yeah, they maybe trod on this witness's rights, but honestly, at the one point they go into a bar and they rough up a bunch of people and they've all got drugs and they dump the drugs into a drink and ruin them.
And how come there's nothing out there, man? That stuff's all milk.
There ain't nothing around. Nobody's holding.
I got a name for you. Sal Boca, Brooklyn.
Bo?
Yeah. B-O-C-A. What about his wife, Kenzie?
Doesn't register. There's been some talk.
About what?
Shipment coming in this week after. Everybody's gonna get well.
Push Reed. Where do you want it?
Oh, yes, sir.
It's Paul. I'm going to check on this address in the Bronx, and if they don't know you, they're at your...
I thought I told you to stand there.
Get that hair done before, sir.
We're going now. Bye. Tell everybody we'll be back in an hour.
And it's all just so that they can talk to their informer. And then they punch the informer basically to keep him safe. If they hadn't punched the informer, everybody in that bar would have known. They went into the room to talk to him, not to rough him up. To some extent, yeah, I agree with that. He definitely has maybe not classic methods, but of course, if he had classic methods, the story never would have happened.
After they get back from D.C., there's a scene where they're finding out that the captain is taking them off the case. Popeye is heading back to his apartment, and all of a sudden, shots ring out. He's being fired upon by Rousseau, the muscle.
The French muscle.
The French muscle. By the time that Popeye gets up to the roof, he looks down, sees Rousseau running off, and this starts off the signature scene of this whole film.
Without a doubt. The car chase scene is frenetic and crazy, and the idea that it was filmed sort of semi-legally.
What do you mean by semi-legally?
They didn't get any official permits at all. And what they did was they used a bunch of policemen they hired to drive in a bunch of cars to block traffic, to keep non-part of the movie people from getting in the way. But there are scenes where they dodged real citizens driving their cars on that road and just filmed it.
There's some scenes where it's so obvious. There are other scenes where it's like when the lady has the baby and he slams
Yeah.
Okay,
and he hits the trash, and that's a setup scene.
Sure,
clearly. But they weave it in so well that you're sort of believable. And the poor guy who gets his car taken, the last thing you hear from him is, "How will I get my car back?" In pieces. It's the answer.
There's no cut in between the time Hackman gets in the car and he does that peel out around.
And does it 100% successfully. Because, it would have been pretty funny if he's, "Give me your car," and he immediately wrecks it.
Bill Hickman drove the car in the chase, was this actor who was playing Muldrig.
The car chase scene was considered one of the greatest in film history. He's not actually chasing another car. He's chasing a subway train, which is the crazy part. It's an elevated subway. He's underneath it trying to make his way down there. And the crazy thing is, all of this was achieved without any level of CGI.
Today, some of those things, they may have put some things in there digitally.
Sure. I think one to pull away from this is, nowadays, what you do is you'd get the permits. Obviously, that goes without saying. You get the permits and you do everything. And you'd have hundreds of extras, hundreds of stuntmen driving cars. And it would balloon the budget by millions and millions of dollars for just that scene. Mm-hmm. It's a great scene. It really pulls together the frenetic level we're at. Because remember, we've been building for the beginning of this movie when it's calm, guy hanging out with his girlfriend in Marseille, all the way to this guy who's on a train. Popeye's chasing him in a car below the train and getting into all kinds of wrecks and crazy things. And at that point, everything is just going really fast at that point. And there's a high level of tension. People are getting shot. People are trying to stop the train. Shout out to the transit authority in New York and in the film for showing the runaway train breaking. That is 100% mechanical. If you noticed in the show, it goes over the trip, and the trip, if you hit the train at a certain speed, that trip flips up and starts a mechanical braking process, so you cannot stop. Okay. And that's how that train stops.
Actually stop.
Yeah, it's actually a whole mechanical thing, because if you hit that thing slow, it lets you go over it, evidently. But if you hit it hard and fast, trips. And that's why the train stopped. Now, even though it stopped really fast, everybody got hurt. Yeah. If you look in the train, you saw people getting thrown. But that was kind of goofy. Like when the bad guy got thrown and his gun got thrown, it was like, wait a minute, it looks like he's being thrown the wrong way.
If you've ever seen the movie poster for The French Connection, we come to the scene where Popeye is chasing Rousseau up the stairs and shoots him in the back. So now we're heading into the final act of the film, and the brown Lincoln makes an appearance again after Rousseau is tailing Sal Boca. Sal has parked it off in this innocuous place for it to be picked up again. Popeye knows that there's something on that car, and eventually they impound the car, they bring it into the lot.
That car's dirty.
They take the car apart. They're looking for the drugs, pulling up the seats, taking out all the oil, ripping everything to pieces. They cannot find the drugs.
And nobody been under that car since it came from the factory. That thing is clean.
I don't buy that, Irv. The stuff is in that car.
Will you find it? I can.
What was the weight of the car when you got it, Irv?
4,795 pounds.
On this manual says 4,675. It's 120 pounds overweight.
They realize that there's one last place that they didn't look, the rocker panel. And that's where they find the heroin.
It was hidden inside the frame. Because back in the day, a big car like that had a big, heavy steel frame with a body on top of it. Nowadays, cars are made with what are called unibodies. So the body and the frame are one thing, and there aren't as much heavy pieces. But this is in the days of big V8s and giant cars, and that's where they had hidden the drugs, in that rocker panel. They had to use a chisel to get it out. And you see later, the drug dealers have to use a chisel to get it out as well. And you see when they're searching the car, they look inside the tires, they look all over the place. So this is well hidden, and they had to work hard to get it. And then they return it to them sort of in the same condition that they got it, which I think is a stretch. But the point is, they wanted to get the car back to them so that they could catch them in the act of recovering and making the deal.
The scene is kind of funny a little bit because the actor who was the third Frenchman, Henri Devereaux, he shows up and he says, I've heard my car was here, I was to pick it up. And
I'm the guest of the United States.
This is where I really like Roy Scheider's character, because he comes out there and he's like his best friend. Like, yeah, no, we've got a car. It's right here. We're going to bring it around for you. Yeah. And they bring this car around.
Take it.
And it looks like they never touched it.
But it's funny because Roy Scheider is exactly doing that. Oh, yeah, we found it, and just totally puts him at ease. And of course, this is where you find out what the role of that actor really was. What his role was, he was supposedly scouting locations for a movie. That's why he needed to move around the city. And that's why he brought this car, because the car is part of the movie.
Right.
And he needed to have the car to see how it would be in scenes. And you find that out when the guy at the door is talking. He's like, why did you leave this car down in a terrible part of town if you're staying up at some other place that's really nice? And like, the director, he wanted to see, and he was out scouting locations and he left it. So all of it, obviously, it was funny, a little bit contrived, but that's really where you find out what the role of the actor. You see the actor, I think, before that, when he and Elaine are having a conversation in the hotel.
Elaine no longer has Russo. Russo is dead. He needs Henri with him. And then they take the car out to a location under Hellgate's Bridge to transfer the heroin to another vehicle, make the money swap.
Right. They're going to take the drugs out and put the money in the same place.
Elaine is driving away with the money, and he comes up over a bridge, and the police have been following them the entire time. Popeye just gives him the exact same wave that Elaine had given him before, because I caught you. We got you. Elaine takes the car back. The police close in. There's a firefight that happens, and I think, Russo ends up killing Boca with a shotgun. Elaine is getting away, and Popeye is pursuing him. Muldrig also sees Popeye following him, and so he starts to follow.
Russo follows him as well into this abandoned warehouse, and he definitely sees Elaine, and he's chasing him, and he's hyper-focused on getting this guy. Russo comes up behind him. Popeye spins around and looks like he's about to shoot him, but he doesn't, because it's his partner. The next guy who pops up looks like the outline of Elaine, and shoots him dead.
Yep.
In a classic foreshadowing. It's Muldrig.
It was very ironic that the entire time Muldrig kept talking about him killing
there was
someone.
a lot of
Popeye shoots him, and it's, oh my gosh.
Foreshadowing.
Yeah, a lot of foreshadowing. Popeye says Frog 1 is in this next room, and you see him reload his pistol, and he goes over, you hear a single shot, and we go to black. And then we see what happened afterwards.
Yeah, in text. A lot of people have a problem with this ending. right? Because it leaves you up in the air to some extent. It also does not pay off. There's no payoff on the bad guys getting their just desserts to some extent, except for Boca, who's like just a hustler trying to hustle and not really. I don't think he was a super bad dude. Didn't see him kill anybody. He gets shotgunned in the chest.
Yeah.
The bad guy does get killed by Popeye, which is good. But this guy, the mastermind Elaine in these, and you can wrap it up with what happens to each one of them if you want.
Joe Weinstock, he was indicted, but he was released because of lack of evidence. Alain Charnier was never found, but he was believed to have returned to France. Interesting, the actor, Henri Devereaux, was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for conspiracy.
The guy that goes to jail is the actor.
The actor's the only guy who goes to jail. I don't know if Friedkin was trying to make a statement there.
Thank you. Well,
And unfortunately for Jimmy and Buddy, they are reassigned outside of narcotics.
yeah, that was probably a huge demotion for him.
Yeah.
And probably result of the fact that the guy got shot. And
Right.
then we didn't get the main guy. But I have to say, it's one of those ones where you're like, at the end of that movie, you're like, you're going to end it like,
Oh, the first time I watched it, I was a little bit angry about it.
Yeah.
You know, that
Yeah.
it suddenly stopped with that.
I agree.
I guess there's
And
a
it was-
sequel.
It was certainly, again, one of those things that were different in this movie that sort of unlike a lot of other movies. There was sometimes an epilogue, but it was usually acted out. It wasn't just usually text. So
If you were to remake this movie today, what would you keep the same and what would you change?
there were a lot of doing a lot of following. And I thought after a while, you're like, yeah, I get it. Okay.
Yeah.
You're following. We know it's hard. After the first couple of times, you realize how hard it is. It was interesting. And the car scene, I don't think you could have done anything better than that. And it worked out really well, with the sole exception of the following. Once that guy got on the train, I failed to see how he knew Popeye was following him. Because you're on the train, you cannot see underneath that train, right?
Oh, yeah. During the car chase sequence.
Yeah. I mean, maybe you'd hear it a little bit, but frankly, those trains are really loud. So I have a hard time saying, why wasn't that guy just sitting there waiting
Right.
for the train to come and getting off at a station? And he made him not stop at the station. Now, I know he almost didn't get on, but the idea that he would take a car and be able to get to that station before he could get off the train.
Right.
And I think they should have somehow shown him the car. And the way I would have done it was I would have had the guy look out the train and look at some windows of a building and see the car.
That there's a car that he's being chased.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because without that, I'm like, why is he so like crazy about getting off? Why is he going to shoot somebody?
Right.
Right. Yeah. He waved at the policeman. Right. And the policeman came up to him. But to be honest with you, even shooting the policeman seems silly because he pulled out of the station. It's like you say to the policeman, I don't know who that guy was. He's crazy. Yeah. He ran into me or something. I don't know. Maybe. I just thought that was a little bit of a stretch, that he would know that it was being followed.
So let me ask you this. Did it groove through the decades or has it lost its beat?
I think definitely. I think a couple of things, like most things that when you watch that were made in decades before you're, maybe for a lot of people who are listening, alive, but some of us who are older realize, is that you really have to put yourself a little bit in that time frame and realize what's going on, and also realize it was the first of these coming. It was not like, I think I made mention before that. So if you watch The Wire, which is really an amazing show that really delves into how police work had to be done in the electronic age with burner phones and with phone tapping. And the analog for the car following in this movie is the phone tapping and trying to trace those phones in The Wire. It really showed you how real police worked. And we just take it for granted. And I was like, oh, yeah, they can show us really how they do these things. This was the first of those. And not the very first, but definitely the not dressed up Peter Marlowe, Spencer Tracy type of policeman detective thing going on. So
I 100% agree with you. I know you were talking about The Wire. The show that it reminded me that I thought of a lot was, there was a show in I can't remember if it was like, it was in the late 90s called NYPD Blue, with Dennis Franz.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of that, where these cops were operating a lot on the edge of things, and they were very driven And sometimes they flirted with going up to the line and sometimes stepping over the line. And I think we've seen other characters who are like Popeye, who are driven to just being almost singularly focused on their task that's at hand.
Yeah,
So.
for sure. Yeah, it's great. A great movie. I think it was really well done. I'd say my biggest takeaway is, and what people would probably notice the most, is how little dialogue there is. There really is
Yes.
not that much dialogue. And so you have to listen to what they're saying because they don't say a lot.
Do we have anything else? We can close it out.
I do not have anything else. I think we probably provide you with far more information than we need. So,
Matt, I just wanted to thank you so much for your time, your perspective, and helping to set the context of the 1970s at that time based on your experience and what you lived through. And I also want to thank our listeners for coming along and joining us on this. If you want to contact us, you can email us at podcasts@cinematicflashback.com or leave a comment on our Facebook page, the Cinematic Flashback Podcast. Also, we're trying to build this show, and we would deeply appreciate a review on the platform you're listening on. If you enjoyed the show, please give us a 5-star review so we can reach more listeners. So join us next time as we take the Wayback Machines to the 70s to explore another film from that decade.
I'm going to bed. I'm tired.